Hello and welcome to lesson 94 of the Learning Guitar series. In this particular lesson, we're going to start discussing chords. And applied together with harmony and theory, we're going to look at many ways we can use chords independently from the genre of music that we're playing. Let's look straight away to the PDF that comes with this lesson. So the very first part of the PDF is dedicated to discussing the way we name chords, because obviously there are differences in between the academic way of naming chords versus what can be done on a guitar. The bottom line is that if you think of chords in terms of triads, let's say C major, then it's all good. It doesn't matter, we can be very academic about it, just write C major, and that means C major. It doesn't matter if it's a guitar playing it or if it's a piano playing it. Those are the notes that we're going to execute. In the case of C, it's going to be C, E, and G. The problem arises the moment we start extending chords. Let's take again C major. Let's think of it as C major Ionian. When we look at the model arpeggio, which we did back, probably, lesson 1, we know that we can extend that C major chord adding a major 7 or adding a 9, adding an 11 or adding a 13. Now, if you think about it, if I wanted to play a C major 13, that would imply me try and play 7 notes at the same time. Now, I'm sure you can spot the problem there from the moment that I have 6 strings available to me, so I cannot possibly play 7 notes. That's the issue number 1 with guitar. Also, the fact that, certain intervals, they're not easy to be played on guitar as opposed to, say, piano, for example. Let's take a simple cluster 1, 2, 3, like the root note of something, the second and the third, played at the same time. On a piano, this would be a piece of cake. It's literally like, 3 fingers next to each other. On guitar, if I try to play 1, 2, and 3, 4 from the perspective of C, I would have root note as a first. Obviously, D would be the second, and it would be there. And now I'm trying to also play an E note, which would be down here. Now, as you can see, this is quite painful to start from. So it's not unusual for us to start using, inversions or put one of these notes an octave above, etc. And the same happens when we use, fourths, sixths, and ninths. With the difference that, of course, like on a theoretical level, the second is the same as the 9, the fourth is the same as an 11, and the sixth is the same as the 13, which to a piano player really means, okay, if it's a fourth, it's in the same octave where the root note is, and if it's an 11, is an octave or more above. As I said, because guitar and the way we, the mechanics of the instruments, sometimes we don't necessarily obey to these rules, to these academic rules, which kind of makes sense when you're trying to write a chord for somebody else. But and in fact, in the diagram, sometimes you see, G13, and G13, which is a dominant 7 chord, to a piano player would mean, okay, I need you to play 7 notes, so the root note, the third, the fifth, the flat 7, the 9, the 11, and the 13. All the notes, basically all the mixolydian mode, including the extensions, all of them at the same time. So 7 notes. As I said, first of all, we cannot play 7 notes. Second of all, even in trying to play all those intervals, maybe there is a way, but, honestly, probably maybe using some 3 fingers tapping on one side and 3 fretted notes on the other, and still we get into 6 notes. So, for example, it's not unusual to see a G13 played this way on guitar, but actually I'm only playing 4 notes. And it's the root note, the dominant 7, the third, and the 13. Here is a 6, okay, which is the same as 13. In fact, sometimes you could even find G6 and still be this. Now, in academic terms, I'm actually not playing a G13. What I'm playing would be called a G7, add 13, because we're going all the way to the 7 and adding a 13 on top of it, but omit 5, because there is no fifth in this chord I'm playing. And, if you saw something on a chart that says G7, add 13, omit 5, and every chord you're trying to write add all this little add-on just for the sake of academic precision. Even make chart reading, even chord reading, just messy. So for guitar, we tend to use our own way of naming chords that kind of makes sense to us. And, as you will see in the PDF, when it comes to the diagram, it's kind of immediate and it makes sense. So all this first part of the PDF goes into even more details in explaining basically, what I just discussed with you, but delving even more into the differences in between, like some sort of more precise and academic writing and the way we would write it for guitar. After that, here you have a few examples of what I was talking about. A couple of the major books, actually, that you can research and find on the topic of chords when it comes to guitar, that comes to mind. Obviously, like one would be Ted Green's book on chords and Joe Pass book on chords. And if you ever come across the Joe Pass book on chords, you realize that Joe Pass didn't even bother to give names to the actual chords that he was presenting in his book. He just divided them into major sounds, minor sound, dominant sound. Because as you will see, some of these kind of overlap, and it's just a matter of sounds. Again, I'll give you a very, very brief example. This is a C major 7 standard. This is actually very common way of playing it. And it's not unusual to play it next to another C major, in this case a C major 6/9. And as you can see, they both sound major. But if we actually go and look deeper into this C major 6/9, actually what I'm playing is root note, 3rd, 6th, and 9, but there is no major 7. Which means that the same chord can be used also in a context of dominant 7. It can go literally next to a C7. I'll show you. This is C7. And now I'm using the same chord in a context of dominant. As a matter of fact, what happens on guitar, we tend to remove notes from chords. And again, in the PDF, I explain it even in more detail. But the bottom line is, generally the 5th, as you noticed already, is the first note to go whenever we need extra fingers to play extensions to chords. And that's not unusual at all. And the reason is that major chord contains a 5th, minor chord contains a 5th, dominant 7 chords contain a 5th. So bottom line, it's not the 5th really that characterized a chord that makes us feel like, oh, that's major, that's minor, that's dominant. Generally, in order of disappearance, as Ted Green that's the kind of word that Ted Green would use for that. The root note is going to be the next one. And again, that's not unusual, especially in contests where maybe there is a bass player. So if there is a bass player in your band, more likely is going to be playing the root note. So if you need extra fingers to, frame certain chords, the root note is going to be next. So again, it's not unusual you find yourself playing a chord which contains maybe 3/7 or major 7 and something else. Okay? Let's keep digging into the PDF. And here is an even more striking example of what I was talking about. Here we have a chord, let's say G11 flat 9. This belongs to the dominant 7 family, mainly because there is a flat 7. As you can see, there is no 3, there is no 5 at all. And yet in this context, we think of it as a dominant chord, and it sounds like a dominant chord. I'll play you a 5/1, so I'll do a G7 going into C major. So you hear the tension, you hear the resolution. The chord in question is this, resolving into C. And as you can see, it does. Now, is this academically a G7? Well, could be G minor. The 3 is not in the chord. Could be a G minor with an 11 and a flat 9. We use it in a context of dominant, and we call it dominant. I literally called it G11 flat 9. Don't worry, this discussion is only going to happen in part 1 of this chord studies, mainly because it needs to be pointed out. And the other thing that needs to be pointed out is why the exercise are based on a 2-5-1 progression. which is kind of like a jazzy progression in a way, like is a chord progression very much present in a lot of jazz music. But please don't think that these chord studies are, going in a jazz direction. These are just chords, and then I can show you different ways you can apply them to different type of music. This is just an excuse to learn chords. And the 2-5-1 is a very good progression to do this, because the chord number 2 is a minor chord, chord number 5 is a dominant 7 chord, and chord number 1 is a major chord. So as a progression per se allows us already to study 3 different family of chords. So we can come across minor chords, dominant chords, and major chords. Already with major and minor, you're covering a lot of pop music and rock music. Sometimes even they might even use dominants, but as you know, a lot of it is basically major and minor. Not only, as we delve into this, and as I'm teaching you also about chord substitutions, you'll also notice that within the 2-5-1, we can also practice half-diminished chords, we can practice diminished chords, we can practice augmented chords. So now out of one single progression is allowing us to delve into 6 different family of chords at the same time. So basically the 2-5-1, as discussed also in the harmony and theory lessons, independently from what key we are in, identify specifically a specific chord progression. And say if we were in the key of G, chord number 2 would be A minor, and chord number 5, for example, would be D7. So now the 2-5-1 in G will be A minor, D7, G. In this case, we're looking at all the diagrams are in the key of C. So the 2-5-1 is D minor, G7, C major, and we'll look at different flavors of it. Beside dominant 7, major and minor, we will be using also like diminished chords, augmented chords, and half diminished chords. Here in the PDF, it explains you why. Just to give you an example, here is a chord that we will encounter, which is G7 flat 9. And of course, this is a dominant chord that would resolve into C major, again, 5-1. So let's say G7 flat 9, C major. But if we look even more closely, this particular chord is basically an A flat diminished. This is A flat diminished, and this is G7 flat 9. Right? So the only difference is basically G in the bass, but I could put A flat in the bass, so literally play A flat diminished, and you would have so it's basically like it's a substitution, but at the end of the day, it's literally the same notes minus the bass, right? The same thing we can say for augmented. So this is, for example, G7 sharp 5. And that's C major tension, resolution. But again, if we look closely to what I'm playing, this root note, 3rd, sharp 5. So this is literally G augmented. And the chord adds a flat 7. So we think of it as a G7 sharp 5, but it's, it literally contains augmented chords, right? And when you think of diminished and augmented, now what comes into play is the properties of diminished and augmented when it comes to guitar. If you remember when we studied the diminished, we know that the diminished can take 4 names. This is not just A flat diminished, this is also D diminished, this is also B diminished, and this is also F diminished. But on guitar, they move symmetrically, which means the chord shape, as you can see, is the same, and I played you all 4 keys. And this will come in the future when we try and play chords and move across the neck, because it allows us, some smoother transitions. I'll give you an example. Again, like a G7 flat 9, going to C, right? But I could go, and I'm up on the neck, because maybe that was the objective. Back to C. Same thing for augmented. Augmented has got this property where it moves in 2 tones symmetrically. So you would have, and again, it takes 3 names. So this could be G augmented, but it's also E flat augmented, and it's also B augmented. So at that point, again, I could do or if I want to go even higher on the neck, last but not least, also the half diminished chord can be studied when we do the 2-5-1. The most common example is, for example, G9. This is G9. I'll try and play it with a... And it's G9 because this is the root note, and then I'm playing the 3rd, flat 7, 9, and 5. But again, if you think, if you have eagle eye, you might have noticed that this shape here, this is actually B half diminished. So G9 is basically a B half diminished with a bass of G. It's the same, it's the same notes. So again, it's not unusual to substitute one for the other. So instead of playing D minor, G7, C major, it's not unusual to go D minor, B half diminished, C major. Anyway, this gives us an opportunity to also practice half diminished chords, augmented chords, and diminished chords. And as you get across to them in the chart, so don't be surprised, they're basically chord substitutions. And in fact, in the PDF, when a chord substitution is really, really obvious, I actually added it in parentheses, so they are also learning about harmony and theory. Let me give you let me show it to you. So let's take, for example, this, which is actually what I just did. Here you have these 3 diagrams, D minor, G9, but in parentheses you can see that I wrote B minor 7 flat 5 going into C major 9. And here is your half diminished shape. Of course, as intervals, I kept the intervals given from the G chord, so you can see you're playing 3, flat 7, 9, and 5. But if I did put the root note here where the 3 is, then this would have become automatically root note, flat 5, flat 7, flat 3, which gives us half diminished. So, for example, that progression would sound like this. D minor 7, G9, but B half diminished, C major 9. It's got a nice sound. Somehow how modern music came about, starting from jazz harmony. As I say, the 2-5-1 is a bedrock of a lot of music from the 40s and 50s. And in fact, somehow we can, when it comes to modern music, it's a bit of a cheesy kind of progression. If I did it like, big chords. And I'm sure there are tons of songs that do this. The moment we started adding substitution to that, composers started doing this to kind of get out of this 2-5-1 thing, but the chord substitution they were applying to the 2-5-1 were giving them new sounds, which then became the harmony of the song. They were not even thought of as substitutions anymore. I'll give you an example. A typical substitution for the 5 chords, so in this case G7, would be F minor. So this chord. And in fact, say, the progression 2-5-1 could be D minor, F minor, C major. You see, it still works like tension, tension, resolution. At some point, this became kind of harmony. In fact, I'm sure you heard songs going D minor, F minor, C major. And you'll find a lot of examples of this in these pages. That's why, like, I know I'm repeating myself, but don't think of this as jazz harmony or something. A lot of these things over time became part of pop music and pop culture. Now, how do you practice and how do you study this? So the diagram are in group of 3. What that means is you look at this horizontally. As you can see, like you have D minor, G7, C major, D minor, some degree of D minor, G7, C major, and of course with all sorts of possible voicings. And you can study these diagrams as in isolation. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and just repeat those. So just to get some muscle memory and photographic memory, you could just go say the first 3 diagrams are this. And the second 3 are this: D9, G13, C major 7. And the third group is D minor, G7 sharp 5, C major 9. And the fourth group is D minor 7, G7, C major 7. And so forth and so on. And you can literally take 3 diagrams and just repeat them until you feel like, you're starting to interiorize it. And of course, like, and then you can move on. But you can also study this diagram vertically. What that means is basically you're looking at one family of chords. So these are all D minors, or these are all G7s, these are all C major, and most of the time they're different from each other. And you can take that as an exercise. So you could go D minor 7, D minor 9, again D minor 7, D minor. And the reason it's done this way is because, as I said, you don't want to think of this as just, oh, this is only 2 5/1s. No, at some point you can make your own chord progression. You could go, I don't know, D minor or A flat minor. But now you'll have enough vocabulary to, to play as many chord voicings as you feel appropriate. Right? Same thing. At the moment you were playing, I was doing 1 bar of D minor, 1 bar of G7, and 2 bars of C major, just to, to keep it symmetrical in terms of length. You could go 2 D minor chords, 2 G7 chords, 2 C major chords. What I mean is, like, you could do this 2 D minor, so 2 bars, D minor 7, D minor 9, then G7, G7 sharp 5, C major, C major 7, C major 9. And, that would sound like this. So you would have D minor 7, D minor 9, G7, G7 sharp 5, C major 7, C major 9, C major 7, D minor 9, D minor 7, C major G13, G7 sharp 5, C major 7, C major 6. Again, how do you want to do it? You can, after a while you can get out of the PDF in terms of following this 2-5-1 thing. The good thing about the 2-5-1, it really gives you a sense of tension resolution. And music is all about tension resolution. Doesn't matter what genre we're talking here. And as I say, the D minor and the G7 represents the tension, and the C major represents the resolution. Most of the time, chord number 2, as you will notice, is not altered. What I mean is D minor is firmly rooted in Dorian and the extension of Dorian. This is Dorian, probably will be a lesson, 18, 19, I don't remember. While the G7 is literally where both the embellishment, so mixolydian embellishment, flat 7, 9, 11, and 13, but also the alterations. So all the notes which are not mixolydian, so sharp 5, flat 5, sharp 9, flat 9, really find a home because they enhance even the tension even more. In that sense, we can kind of agree that most of the time altered chords, so altered dominant chords, G7 sharp 5, are chords that you might encounter more often in jazz music or in fusion music. Obviously, bossa nova, R&B, though R&B might have some of those too. Pop music, I don't know, not sure. Not a lot of those in Guns N' Roses. I don't know, that kind of stuff. As you move along, and as I said, these are like 6 pages of chords. And some repeat themselves. I mean, like, I tried somehow for each of these little progression to be musical. And so, D minor 9 is present multiple times, for example, right? But the idea is, that all these progression on their own have a musicality. Let's say, for example, this one where you have D minor 9, G7 flat 5, which is basically a D flat 7, so G7 flat 5, and D flat 7 is basically the substitution here, landing into C major 7. And so the idea is like, so you have a melody on top going, right? Oops. And again, if I bring it back to a pop universe, where now I'm literally going to play triads because, as I said, there's substitutions. You would have D minor, D flat 7, C major. And again, you might have, but there are pop songs, like, singer-songwriter kind of stuff. You see, I mean, I'm sure you heard this sound, and probably you never realized that all they were is an evolution to what happened to a 2-5-1 progression over time, right? Just to escape basically the cheesiness of it, and it became a thing on its own. Just one more. So, for example, this one is interesting. So you have a D minor 6, which is basically, again, a B half diminished substitutions. This is basically a D minor triad with a 6th in the bass, with B in the bass. Here you have F minor over G, so G11 flat 9, basically, an F triad. And then you have a C major 6-9. And again, this way you can really hear the evolution of the progression, because we went from D minor, G7, C major, to B half diminished, F minor, C major. This is basically the starting point, and in time we ended up with this. I hope it makes sense. We also have Lydian. Whenever you see a chord, a major chord, which, in its name at some point has sharp 4 or sharp 11, that means that we're going for the Lydian sound. Again, if you remember from the major mode, we know that chord number 1 is major and is Ionian, but, chord number 4 is also a major chord and is Lydian. Now, basically, we are altering the 1 chord in the 2-5-1 by adding the Lydian sound to it. So in terms of tension resolution, it doesn't feel as resolved as when we're using normal Ionian extensions. But again, for those of you into more jazzy and fusiony sound, you might actually enjoy this kind of, the feel of Lydian. So in the case of that progression, what you would have is basically D minor, G13, and then C major 9, sharp 11, and here is your sharp 11 here. See, like it's resolving, but somehow is leaving the door open to something else. Because this is basically an alteration. Chord number 1 doesn't have a sharp 11 in it. We are adding it and give it a Lydian feel. Another interesting example is the use of slash chords, where we can name the same thing in 2 different ways. So what's interesting about, for example, this progression here, 1, 2, 3, where you have D minor 6, which, is a D minor with a bass of B, if you want to think of slash chords, a G11 flat 9, which is an F minor with a bass of G, and a C major 7, which we can look at as an E minor with a bass of C. So basically what you have is these 3 fingers here doing this. So they're basically moving parallel on the guitar, and all it's changing is the bass, in the sense that the bass is going B, G, C, and you have B, half diminished, So D minor 6. This is an F triad now with a bass of G. And this is now an E minor triad with a bass of C. But it's, again, it's an interesting sound. Again, we started from this. And ended up with this. Okay, I think this is enough explanation for what the PDF is going to present you with. Probably, like, I spent even too much time talking, but I hope it's kind of making it clear the potentiality, what's hidden in it beside learning chords. You learn about harmony theory. You learn about the progression of, the history of music in terms of creating chord progressions which go beyond the 2-5-1, So there is a lot to dig in. And like I said, we're looking at this group of frets, and in next lesson I'm going to go up the neck of the guitar. One last thing is, like, in case you want to loop some of these progressions and just play on top of it, just for the fun of it. Again, all the progressions which are purely Dorian, Mixolydian, Ionian, so when there is no alterations, basically, like a simple D minor, G7, C major, you can use C Ionian over it and, just have fun. So you have this kind of thing. And this is just C Ionian. And if you're into pentatonics, as you know, C major, the relative minor is A minor, so you have A minor pentatonic, basically. And you can use that vocabulary. It's going to sound a bit different if you try and do that, but when the G7 is actually altered, it's still going to work, but it's definitely going to sound a bit more jazzy because, certain chords, especially altered chords, are inspiring other type of scales. But we've done melodic minor, so if you want to go back to that and, and use those, so whenever a chord is altered, you can always use, superlocution from the melodic minor modes and more. There is Phrygian, there is a lot of stuff. At some point, we're going to look at studies where combining some of this progression with the right scale that will go with it. But at this stage, again, even the C Ionian was still, it will sound like some degree of alterations. I'll give you an example. In this case, I'm going to use G7 altered, so maybe G7 sharp 5. And still use C Ionian. Although, as I said, that was a super look, and it might have, obviously, more of a jazz vocabulary attached to it. But nevertheless, you can still have just fun, playing C Ionian all over this, and and have fun, and maybe plug in a distortion, and you play blues. You can use that kind of phrasing. Why not? I mean, it's like, please don't make the mistake. This is not about jazz. It's only about jazz if you want it to be. Okay, I think that's enough for this lesson. Hopefully, the video won't confuse you too much, but all the information is in the PDF and hopefully is clear enough. Thank you so much for following until this point. Until next time, bye.